So as for the last presentation, prepare yourself for an engaging session with Sipke as he dwells into the world of Elsa workflows, an innovative engine derived from Orchard Core's workflow module. Join him as he provides a comprehensive overview of Elsa's feature set, compares it to Orchard Core workflows, and explores integration possibilities. We can't hear you.
I'm muted. Thank you for that. Thank you, Victoria. Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending. Let me start by sharing my screen. And switching to PowerPoint if it works. There we go. All right, so thank you for attending. I'm going to give you a demo of Elsa workflows, and I will first explain a little bit what it is. So in this talk, I'm going to show you what it is, but also how it compares to Orchard. And so let me just summarize first the Elsa workflows. There during the breakout session, there was a question of how does it relate to Orchard workflows. So first of all, it's basically just a set of .NET libraries that enable you to define and execute workflows using code. And those workflows can be created in code, but also using a visual designer. Why did I create Elsa workflows in the first place? So this was maybe 7 years ago, where I was working with a team on a project, and this project needed a workflow engine and a designer. It wasn't an Orchard project, fortunately, and we couldn't find anything that met our requirements. So ultimately, we decided to use Windows Workflow Foundation, at least for the time being. And unfortunately, that project failed. And I don't know if it's because we didn't use Orchard or because we use Windows Workflow Foundation, and we may never know. But I couldn't stop wondering, what if we just could have used at least the Orchard Core Workflows module? Because after all, that module is it's pretty awesome. It's very easy to use. It's very extensible. So that thought it didn't let me go. So I think about 1 year later, I think maybe 2, I just started coding, and that's basically how Elsa was born. I started with copying the code from parts of the code from the Orchard Core Workflows module, and started my own library, basically. So in the next few minutes, I will show you some demos of how to use Elsa workflows in various scenarios. I hope you'll enjoy it and learn something new. So with that, let's go to the first demo, which I have here. So I have a small solution. The first thing I would like to show is very basic. It's a Hello World program. And just to show one of the most important aspects of this entire endeavor is that I want a workflow engine that is decoupled from Orchard, so that you can use it in any .NET application. So what we have here is a very basic console application. And the only thing it references is Elsa. And because Elsa does consist of a bunch of services that it needs internally, it's easiest to just set up a service collection. It's not a hosted application here, so we don't have a host build or anything. So we just construct services, a services object ourselves, add the necessary Elsa services, and then build the service provider. And this gets us a way to resolve a thing called a workflow runner. And this is a very low-level service to execute activities. And that's what we see here. So here I'm defining the most basic workflow you can imagine, which is a single-step activity called WriteLine. And yeah, let's just run it to see that it works. That's the wrong demo. Let me switch to demo 1. And there you go, Hello World. And to me, this is amazing because it's something I always wanted to do ever since I looked at the documentation of Windows Workflow Foundation. I always found it so cool that you could just run an activity. And with Elsa, you can do that as well. Obviously, this is not really a proper workflow. Maybe a more interesting example would be something like this. So what we have here is another type of activity. This is a sequence, and a sequence it's an activity that itself schedules child activities, and it's basically the child activities are basically executed one after the next. So first one is this write line, this will execute, and then the next one will execute. So very basic, but it also shows something very powerful in Elsa, and that is the ability for an activity to be a highly specialized state machine in its own right. So you can imagine that if you can do a sequence, then you can probably also do things like a flowchart or a state machine or even a BPMN 2.0 activity, which you don't have, to be clear, but it's on the roadmap. So let's just run this as well, just for good measure. And there we go. So this also works fine. And what I've shown here is basically the core of the Elsa library. So it provides a set of services to define and execute workflows. Now, everything else is built around this. So that includes the designer, persistent services, other services to trigger workflows based on events, etc. So let's move on to a more interesting demo, which is an ASP.NET Core project, which also hosts the designer, which we'll take a look at in a second. But I also wanted to show a little API, which is, it's not a Fluent API. In Elsa 2, we use the Fluent API to build workflows from code. But in Elsa 3, this is the latest iteration, which is soon to be released. So to be clear, it's still in preview, but it's going to be released. It was supposed to be released today, but it's going to be a few days later. But what we have here is a more elaborate workflow with 3 steps. So here we start with a trigger, an HTTP endpoint that listens on a certain path, a write line activity, and then a response here. And so this is defined in code. And of course, in many scenarios, you'll want to use a designer, which is a more powerful feature because it allows you to visualize your process. But before I show that, let me also show some other options you may have. So instead of doing code, or even instead of using the designer, you could have a JSON file. In this case, it's a JSON file exported from the designer, which you can then host as part of your application in case you want to do, in case you want to deploy your workflows as part of your application. Because in a way, if you change a workflow using a designer in production, you're changing code in production, which may or may not be a good idea depending on your use case. So this is an option that exists as well. And as a very, very experimental feature, there's also a custom DSL that you can use if you want to for basic steps. So it's still, as I mentioned, experimental. It doesn't support all of the constructs that exist. But just to walk you through this example, because it matches the C# structure here, where we have the HTTP endpoint, the write line, write HTTP response. Here we have a simplified syntax. So it's a little mix between JavaScript and JSON, if you will, where you define your object. So that's the activity, assign it some properties, and so on. And there's a feature that allows you to map these activities to functions so that you can use this syntax, which cleans it up a little bit. So for smaller workflows, this could be something interesting to use. All right, so let's start this demo too, which is, as I mentioned, a ASP.NET Core application. And what it hosts is both the workflow server. It's acting as a workflow server, similar to if you would start a Orchard Core project. It's a CMS server which hosts workflow definitions and can execute those workflows. So this is conceptually a little bit the same, but just focused on hosting and executing workflows. What we're looking at here is the a built-in login screen, and I'll go into a little bit more detail of how this designer was implemented. But one thing to be aware of is that this is it's decoupled from the server, so it's like a spa. I will log in with the default username and password, and then let's create a new workflow definition. And this also allows me to show you some of the differences, and we'll look at the Orchard workflow in a few minutes as well. But just to guide you around a little bit, on the left-hand side we have an activity picker from where you can drag and drop activities onto the canvas, which is in the middle section here. So this should be very familiar to you if you're used to the Orchard workflows module. But one improvement is that whenever you select an activity, you have the activity property editor at the bottom. So this allows you to quickly switch between activities and make changes to their settings. So let's do a simple Hello World demo. So let's use an HTTP endpoint, which also exists in Orchard. It allows you to configure the path. So I'm actually going to rebuild the same workflow that I showed here in C#. So consisting of 3 activities, HTTP endpoint, a write line, and an HTTP response. So we'll accept GET requests, and we'll mark it as can start workflow, which means we are activating this trigger. This is a trigger activity, and we'll say hello world designer, and we'll add the write line and an HTTP response. And we'll call this HTTP hello world. So here we see the workflow definition properties. Let's make sure these are connected. And as you may have noticed, this designer also supports padding and zooming. And here we have the HTTP response, which allows us to configure the response to send. And one thing to notice as well is that for each input, we can change the default UI to use a script or a dynamic expression like JavaScript or Liquid. And in Orchard, you have some fields, I think they support JavaScript. Most of them support Liquid. And here you can choose which one you want to use. And in this case, we don't need a dynamic expression, so we'll just use hello world. Content type. It will try to determine the content type based on your content here. So for example, if I were to return a JavaScript object, it's gonna assume you want to return JSON, but you can control it explicitly from here. And in our case, we'll just use plain text. All right, so let's publish this one. Speaking of publishing, workflow definitions in Elsa are versioned like content items in Orchard. So here you have a version history, and as you make changes and publish them, it will create new version records, and then you can switch back if you want to. You can revert to an older version or delete an older version if you want to. All right, let's just run this one. So we are in this URL. We'll go to workflows, designer, and there you go. So what I did, I just made a GET request through the browser. This prefix is a default prefix. It's an optimization technique to not have to route every HTTP request through the workflows middleware, because that would be too inefficient, but it's optional. If you don't like it, you can remove it or of course change it. All right, so what else can I show? How about we want to create a reusable bit of logic. So in C# you can create functions, which you can then invoke from other places in your application. And in Elsa you can do that as well. And one way, of course, would be by creating custom activities. And there's two or actually three ways in Elsa to create custom activities. One is to implement a class that inherits from activity, and that would be that. But what if you have more complicated logic that might involve timers and events and basically a long-running sub-process? You can do that as well, and it's called composite activities, which are basically mini workflows that you can then reuse as activities in your main workflow. And I'll show you an example in code first. So for example, here I have a custom activity, and it inherits from composite, and it has a return type of double in this case. And it accepts 2 bits of input, A and B. And the key here is to set the root property, and the root property is of type iActivity, which means that composites will schedule their root activity, which itself, of course, can be any activity, including sequences, flowcharts, or whatever you want. And this example, in the real world, you wouldn't implement a sum activity using a composite, but just to demonstrate that it's possible if you want to, I'm showing here 2 activities. One to write some text to the console, and another activity that produces the sum of 2 input values and then assigns it to the output through the set output activity. Now, what I'm going to show you is how to do this in the designer, and then use it in an actual workflow. So let's see, let's make sure this is cleaned up. All right, so let's start with replicating the sum activity. But in this case, we'll not just take 2 numbers, but we'll accept an array of numbers that will for which we'll produce a sum. And to start, we'll start giving this a name. We'll configure this workflow to be usable as an activity. And then we'll define its signature, basically. So we'll define one input, which would be the numbers to sum. And we'll use the double data type. So variables are strongly typed in Elsa, but they can also be dynamically typed. So you can just use object, which will translate to a dynamic object, and that's the same for this JSON type here. But this is a legacy thing that I'm going to remove. So let's stick with double here. We'll configure this variable to be an array of doubles, and then this information is more like metadata that will be used in the UI as you use this activity in a designer. So this will be numbers, and we'll say the numbers to sum, and click save. So that's the input. And then of course we want to, like in a function, you want to return a result, maybe. And in this case, you will definitely want to return the sum. So we'll call it the sum. Something like that. Okay, so now that we have defined the signature of this function, we'll have to do the implementation. And for that, in this case, it will be very simple. It will just be a single set output activity. Which accepts, which has 2 inputs. One is the output to which to bind the value that we provide here. So that's what this output activity will do. It will evaluate this input and assign it to this output. So this is going to be a simple bit of JavaScript. The first thing we'll do is get the value of the input called numbers. So we'll say numbers equals get numbers. So you may have noticed that there is IntelliSense support, but the IntelliSense support for the inputs got broken some time ago, so that needs to be fixed. But it will still work. So as you also may have noticed, it uses a convention. So based on the variable name, in this case numbers, there will be a function generated in real time that that prefixes the variable name with get, so that it becomes a function that you can get the actual value that it has at the moment of execution of this expression. And then the sum will be well, numbers will be an array, so we should be able to do reduce. And reduce takes a lambda, I think it was previous current. And then we'll do previous plus current and a default value of 0. And that should return the sum of all of the input numbers that we provide. And then assign it to the output of this activity, or sorry, of this workflow. So let's see what happens when we publish this. This is published. Now, what should have happened on the left-hand side, we should have seen a new category called workflows, which is a default category for workflows configured to be used as activities. But that's, as I mentioned, it's broken at the moment. But if I refresh and create a new workflow, which we'll call calculator. So this is going to be the workflow consuming this custom activity that we just created. So here it is. We have a sum. And it will have one setting called numbers, which we configured. So let's see what happens if we provide an array of values. So let's say 2 and 8. And maybe a third one. And to see what it actually produces, first we need to capture its output. So this sum will produce an output called sum. And in order to use it, we need to capture it using a variable. And this is currently the case. There will be an update that allows you to access the output of any executed activity in subsequent activities. But for now, the way to do it is through variables. So we'll create one here. We'll call it the sum. And in case you're worried about naming conflicts, every activity that executes has its own scope. Every composite activity has its own variable scope, so it shouldn't collide. Okay, so we'll assign the output to this variable, and then we can use it. So we could, if assuming we're going to invoke this workflow from an HTTP request, we could send it back to the HTTP response, which is what we'll be doing. So we'll return the status code of OK, and then the content would be, let's do liquid for this example. So let's say we want to return JSON this time. So we're gonna say result, or let's call it sum. And then the syntax will be variables dot the sum. And content type will be JSON. All right, so let's publish this. And now I will show you how to invoke a workflow through a REST API. So we already took a look at the HTTP endpoint, which is a trigger. But if you have a workflow that doesn't have triggers, you can invoke it, of course, from code, but also through the REST API. For that, we need a definition ID that we find here. Okay, and then let's try this one. Let's double check the, sorry, that's the wrong one. I want to go to this one, execute. So this is an API endpoint exposed by one of the modules of Elsa workflows, and it allows you to provide a definition ID, and then the execute is like an action that we want to perform on this workflow. We'll send this. And this is the result we got back. So that's pretty cool. But what if we didn't want to hard code this array? Maybe we want to provide it as an input to the workflow. And that works as well. For that, what we will do is just use the get input function. It allows us to provide the name of the input that we are expecting. So let's call these, I'll call this input numbers. Let's make sure we publish this change. And then from Postman here, when we use this REST API, it allows you to provide an object called input. And here we can provide a dictionary of input. So we said we want to provide numbers. So let's say 5 and 9 and 4. And there you go. So that works as well. So that was quite easy to do. Okay, I'm just checking the time to see how much time I have for additional features to show here, because basically my talk is split up into 2 big demos. That's just a show and tell of Elsa as it is. And the second one, I'll let you guess for a few minutes. Okay, so okay, I just reminded myself what else I wanted to show if time permitted. So I mentioned composite activities. I showed you what we can do with workflows and then invoke them as activities, which is cool. But let's say you have a very complicated process that you want to implement in a workflow. Typically, if you were to do that in a workflow engine like Orchard or even Elsa, your workflow could become very, very big with many activities because it's quite low level, right? So you have activities like set variable, maybe some looping, like what we have here, while, for each, etc. So what if you could group certain parts of your workflow into into groups, into containers? So we can do that as well. Let's create a new workflow. And we'll use a for each. So the for each activity more or less models the for each statement in C#. And what does a for each statement consist of? A list of items that you want to iterate over, and a body that represents the logic to execute on each iteration. So let's use JavaScript to create a bunch of items. Let's call these items fruits. So we'll have a banana, maybe an apple, and maybe some orange. And now let's say we just want to print this out to the console. So for that, we go into the body, which if we look at the C# implementation of this for each activity, the body is of type iActivity. So, and this goes back to what I mentioned earlier with the Elsa activities. You basically have specialized state machines that you can implement, and this will implement scheduling the body activity upon each iteration. So let's see what that looks like here. Here we want to basically print the current item. And to get the current item, we need to capture the output of this activity. So let's create a variable here. By the way, these variables are scoped at the workflow definition, so they are global in scope. And there's going to be a feature enhancement that allows you to define through the designer variables that are scoped to the current activity that you're working on. Like in Windows Workflow Foundation, they have that as well. But for now, let's call this the current root variable, which is of type string. Yeah, and we'll save this. current fruit. And now, and as I mentioned, this is a global variable, so it means it's in scope of this body of for each. So we can say JavaScript, and then we can say the fruit is, then we can say get current fruit. So for variables, the IntelliSense is working properly, which is good. All right, so this time, instead of evoking it through Postman or using an HTTP endpoint, let's use something else called event. Event is a general purpose trigger that you can invoke through a REST API or from code, and it's very similar to the signal received activity in Orchard. So we can give it a signal name or an event name. Let's call it fruits. We'll connect it to this guy here, and of course, we'll mark it as can start workflow. And we'll call this workflow fruity loops. Now it's published, and that's very important. As long as if your workflow isn't published but in draft, if there's no latest published version that is, then it won't be executed, and this trigger won't be indexed. So now it's okay. We don't need the definition ID. We just need to run a API to trigger some named event. So in this case, it was fruits. Okay, we got a backend okay, so let's double check the applications console. And indeed, we see the 3 iterations being printed to the console. All right, so let's switch back to the slides. And actually, let's skip through these boring slides here, because this is where I want to go next. Is, as I mentioned earlier at the start of my talk, I was looking for a way to somehow use the Orchard workflows module in my own applications without having a dependency on Orchard. And now you may be wondering, what would it take to take these improvements and then use them back in Elsa? And let's take a look what that might involve. For that, I will switch to another solution, which is a proof of concept. So if you wonder what would it take to use Elsa in Orchard, well, Orchard is modular. So the first thing you would have to create is a module, which is what I have here. And then maybe you need some controllers to manage workflow definitions. So we got that here as well. So we have a workflow definition controller, a workflow instance controller, and we need something to host the designer. And as I mentioned earlier, the designer is implemented as a reusable component. More specifically, it was created using Stencil, which is a web component generator, if you will. And it's a very nice framework because it allows you to implement web components that can be hosted in basically anywhere. It could be in the HTML files or React or Angular or Vue, without having dependencies on frameworks like React or Angular or Vue. It's very lightweight, so that's perfect for the requirement to be able to rehost the designer anywhere. So for that, we have a view here. So we have a workflow definition edit view that basically hosts, in this case, a custom HTML5 component. I'll show you that as well. So here what I have here is a client lib folder, which allows me to more easily integrate with the API exposed by this designer web component. And I use TypeScript. Sorry, I used did I? I used TypeScript for that. I don't think. Or did I? Oh, I forgot. Did I use actual Stencil? Yeah, I'm using Stencil for that as well. It's not a requirement, but it's it's very convenient to use it because stencil allows you to use GA6, which is very similar to the GA6 syntax from React, which allows you to easily bind data to your HTML components. So anyway, so what I did here, I created a definition editor which simply encapsulates this thing here, which is Elsa Studio, and that is a custom element. That is what you would have to host in your HTML page. If you were to host this directly on an HTML page that you create yourself, that would give you the full dashboard experience that I just showed you. But it's programmable, so that's the reason I created two components here, because for when I want to edit a workflow definition, I don't want to do everything through the dashboard. I want to leverage Orchard Core's UI principles as much as possible. So let me just show you. It will be easier to understand. So I'm going to run my ASP.NET Core application, which references both Orchard, or actually just Orchard, and of course the custom module, which internally references Elsa packages. All right, so starting this one. There we go. So I already went through setup just for fear that it might not work from scratch. So it's already set up. Okay, so here we see, as provided by this custom module that I just mentioned, there's a navigation provider. And then here we have this workflow definitions view. So this view looks very much the same. It's in fact, it's a copy of this view, but then simplified a little bit because I didn't have time yet to implement all of the features like searching, etc. But yeah, so if let's create a new workflow. This screen you'll find familiar as well if you've worked with Orchard workflows, because it's also a copy. So let's call this Hello Orchard from Elsa. All right, and this is what I was just talking about. So you don't see the login screen or the home screen of the designer that we saw here when I refresh this. So this is the separate, the other ASP.NET Core project. We don't want to see this when we edit a workflow directly. We just want to see the designer. So here, this is the rehosted designer. And you may notice that there's a new category called content. And this is, of course, this will be one of the main reasons to integrate Elsa into your Orchard application, because of the deep integration you get with the Orchard ecosystem, such as leveraging events like content items created, or the ability to create content, and anything else that you are used to today in Orchard. So let's see how this might work. So I have prepared this little workflow here. It uses the HTTP endpoint that we saw that we've seen in a previous demo. And here I'm leveraging a custom activity called create content. And it's functionally it's the same as the create content task in Orchard Core. So it allows you to specify the content type, whether to publish the content or not, and some properties that you can set to configure the content being created. But what's nice is that here you get to choose between JavaScript, and as you can see, this is an actual JavaScript object and not just JSON, or you can switch to Liquid if you prefer. And then another nice feat, I think, is the ability to capture the created output, which is strongly typed. So there's a little UI glitch here, but it reads content item, which is a type that I registered with this application. So here we see the type content item. And that's useful because whenever you want to do something with the content item, for example, write some aspects of it in to the response. In this example, you can, if you switch to JavaScript, you should be able to see the IntelliSense kicking in. So here we have get created content item. Well, I think I broke something. The idea was to show you that it has an ID property, content item ID, etc. So there's a little bit of work to do here. And the same goes for Liquid. Liquid currently doesn't have IntelliSense, but that is on the list. All right, so just to show you this demo in action, this is an HTTP endpoint that listens for the articles path. It accepts post requests. And so this is basically me implementing quickly an API endpoint using workflows to create content. So let's see, make sure this is published. So it's published at version 7. That's okay. Now switching back to Postman. Okay, so here I have prepared a little Postman request. That this is the wrong one. I guess this is the right one. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so this is the path that I'm exposing, and I configured from the workflows module, I configured it to listen at WF instead of workflows because that path was already taken from some module, probably the workflows module in Orchard. So I had to change this. That's fine. So here I'm posting a body with a title and a body. So as you can see here, that's going to be used in the create content item here. So here I'm getting get article params, which is the output of the HTTP endpoint. So basically this body here will be parsed by the HTTP endpoint and assigned to this variable. So that's where this name comes from. So let me send this. And it did indeed create actually, let me change this to something else. Let's say 8. Okay, so now let's go to workflow instances. And the order is off. It should be ordered the other way around. But here, created a moment ago, we see that indeed this this workflow executed. So HTTP endpoint was executed. Then it created the content item. Then write line was executed, as we can see here, with the actual value that was used at the time. And then, of course, the HTTP response. So we should also be seeing the content item actually being created here. So yeah, so that was the Elsa workflows version of it. Of course, you can do this also with Orchard core workflows. So just for comparison, let's take a look at the Orchard implementation. Well, that's not what I want. Let me delete this one. This was a different story. I will get to that if I have time. All right, so let's do it like this. And I'm skipping the write line. There's no write line activity that I'm aware of. Of course, we could use the log activity. So I think we have here. Yeah. So that would look something like this. So and let's take a look at its properties. And this is another difference, although this is for a very good reason. This includes a SAS token or a security shared access signature, I think it's called, to prevent anonymous requests from executing the workflow. And Elsa 3, you will have to either not expose your workflows through an endpoint. And if you did want to invoke workflows through REST APIs, you will have to use the request that I've shown here, which requires authorization if you want to. By default, it requires authorization. You would have to explicitly opt out of that. So let's go back here. yeah, we can actually save this one, and I think this one is configured correctly. And as you can see, it's very similar in terms of settings, because I literally copied the well, the idea behind create content task into the Elsa Orchard module. So if we run this one using this token, if it still works.
Sorry for interrupting, but and now it's time for the Q&A session, actually. So
Yeah, perfect.
if you can finish this, then I would ask the question, because there are many questions.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Oh, is it okay now?
Yes, I was just wrapping up, but you wrapped up for me, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the first question was why YAML was not adapted for definitions.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Why YAML sorry, was not adapted for definitions.
Oh, that's purely a matter of timing and priority. But YAML files could totally be used, and it would be a good structure for workflows, because JSON works fine. If you want YAML, that's possible too. But if the question is related to the custom DSL, that is because I also wanted to do things like this. So just give me a few seconds to explain. So let's take, for example, this DSL here. What I also want to be able to do is things like this. So for, let's say E or I equals whatever. So I also wanted to be able to have my own syntax and map this statement to the for activity in that we have in Elsa. And I'm not sure if this is very suitable if you just use a YAML parser. Maybe that's the case. I don't know, but that's the main reason I wanted to try my own DSL.
What was the question about? Actually, yes.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
Moving on to the next question. Why did you join .NET Foundation with Elsa? What advantages does it provide as opposed to it being an independent project?
Yeah, so what I found very important for Elsa is that it remains, well, its continuity. I want to ensure its continuity. So if I would ever decide to quit, or something were to happen, or I lose interest, whatever the reason may be, I realize there's quite a few people depending on Elsa today, even back in the day when I decided to have it become part of the .NET Foundation. So my understanding, at least at the time, was that that would be a good way to help ensure continuity, and that the keys to the repo, if you will, are shared, and also to give some trust to the users that that it's in good custody. So that's mainly the reason.
Thank you. The next question was, when would you use the workflow builder from code only without a designer UI? It seems to me that without a workflow designer, I would just write C# code as usual.
Yeah, so very fair question. And it depends on the kinds of workflows you would build, because workflows are useful, of course, because, well, if you can visualize them, it helps understand the process, but also just being able to integrate human tasks and computer tasks, or well, humans and machines over long-running processes, that can be very complicated to implement using just C# code. You could do it using choreography with eventing, etc. But if you could orchestrate those processes, then it becomes maybe easier to manage, and at the very least easier to implement using a workflows engine. And it's my understanding that that's one of the reasons people use Workflow Core, for example, which is also a workflows engine, but without a designer.
Can you modify a code workflow with the designer? Start with what is coded, change it through the designer, and use the modified one.
Oh, and so that it becomes C# again, or is it or as JSON, or what is the what would be the expectation? Let me just assume that that the question is, can it then be written back to C# if that's the question?
No, it's the other way around. I think it was making basic workflows in code and then extending them via the UI. That's how I read it.
Oh, okay, yeah. So in fact, that is possible with Elsa 3, because what happens with, for example, this Hello World workflow, it will be found by a workflow provider, and it will actually store a workflow definition in the database. So there's more or less a copy, and it's actually going to serialize this graph, which is then used by the designer. So technically, you could then use the designer to make changes and then save new versions. So this would allow you to start from a coded workflow and then make changes in the designer. However, there's a caveat, because if you use C#, you can also, so for example, here I have a write line, and here it's a string literal, but if you use a C# lambda, then that's not going to be serialized. So this is this you will want to change to JavaScript or Liquid, which would be possible, but you would have to be aware of things like this. And also, I haven't tried it. It's on my list of things to add support for, because it can be very powerful to be able to tweak certain settings at the very least for workflow definitions, even if just the ability to unpublish or disable a workflow at runtime. Even if the workflow was created in code, you don't always want to do a new deployment if you're using a workflow engine. So in summary, the foundation is there for support to support that, but it's an untested feature at the moment.
Where's Elsa used that you know of? What are the existing use cases?
Yeah, so there's one main customer that I work for that uses it heavily. They're based in Chicago, and they use it in their mortgage platform. That's one customer. Another one is based in the Netherlands, and they're big in the insurance industry. So they use it to help their customers automate their backend processes. And they use Elsa workflows for more low-level orchestration of certain of processes that they, and for them it's very important that the entire process remains visual. So those are two customers I'm well aware of. Other than that, I can only guess what they might be using based on some of the questions I received on GitHub.
Yes. Can we use email to create blog posts or content?
Can you use email to create blog posts? So, for example, you would imagine somebody sending an email from Outlook, let's say, to some mail server, and then that would then kick off a workflow. If that's the question, then most certainly, but you would have to build that integration yourself. So there's no activities out of the box in Elsa that listens for stuff happening in some mail server. But you could most certainly create those activities and then set up such a process quite easily.
I think we have time for one more question. Is it possible to customize Elsa's UI?
That's a very good question. So this designer here, it wasn't designed to be customized and not, well, to be extended, yes, but to be customized, not so much. Doesn't mean it won't be, it just requires additional effort. But there's another effort underway, which builds a dashboard using Blazor, and that is supposed to be customizable within a fixed design system. So it uses material design. So you will be using that, or at least it uses Mud Blazor, which is a component library. So depending on its customizability, you will be able to customize it yourself. And of course, because this designer is decoupled from the workflow server, you can always create your own designer from scratch. But it depends on what level of customization you're looking for. And this designer here internally uses X6, which is a diagram library. Let's see if I find it here. So this library, it's very easy to use and very customizable. So here, for example, is a simple diagram, a flowchart diagram, and the styling, everything is customizable. So yeah, so depending on what you're looking to customize, there are options, even if it's just overriding certain CSS styles. So just to give you a quick look, this is the source code of the designer, and it is modular. But I found that many people, especially coming from .NET, they're not very comfortable extending or providing custom designer plugins through Stencil. Although Stencil isn't necessary, but it's quite helpful if you were to use it. But you would basically create a custom plugin, and the plugin allows you to listen for certain events and then hook custom components into the designer, if you will. But as I mentioned, that is not a fully developed feature yet.
Thank you. Thank you for the answers.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And that was the last presentation for today. I would share just one slide as well. So as we reach the end of the event, I would like to say a big thank you for all of the attendees, and thank you for your active participations and questions. And I would like to say a special thank you, not just for the speakers, but also the organizing team. Because they were really hardworking and they made this event happen. And I would like to wish you a fascinating event or day. It depends on where you live. And take care and stay inspired. Thank you.